When you think of a curse, what do you think of? I think for most people, they're thinking of witches and magic spells, or maybe some kind of ancient mythology like the Curse of the Pharaohs, or superstition like in baseball with the Curse of the Bambino. What I don't think most people think of immediately is their own God. And yet, according to the Bible, the only thing that has ever cursed anything is Yahweh. And he did so as soon as he possibly could. We're talking within the first 800 words of the Protestant canon. Now, considering that the entire canon is about 800,000 words, that means that within less than 1/10 of 1%, this God is already cursing his creation. So I want to talk about this first curse. Actually, this first curse is a handful of curses. It's a couple curses for the serpent, a few for the woman, and a few for the man. And it's funny to just stop and think for a second that all of this is happening with essentially 4 beings. You have God, who makes this perfect world, supposedly starting to do so for just one man, Adam. Even though it's perfect, Adam is in need, and so he gets a helper, Eve. And again, even though it's perfect, you have a supposedly deceptive serpent, who some Christians would associate with the devil, although that is not clear in Genesis here. And between those 3, they bring sin into the world, and thus their curses, and thus not just the fall of them, but the fall of mankind. The story is problematic for literally 1,000 different reasons, but I just want to walk through the different curses for each of these and see if this makes sense for a fair, loving, and just God. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. And you've heard me talk about this enough that collective punishment or generational curses make 0 sense for actual justice. So I guess my real goal is to show you just how much injustice this has actually brought about, if the story were true. So turning to our Bible, let's actually just read what is going on here. And this comes to us in Genesis 3, starting with verse 14. The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." That is the curse to the serpent. And we're not going to spend too much time here, but I want to point out a few things. One is, yes, many Christians who are after the fact trying to put Jesus back in as many places as they can in the Old Testament will say that he is referencing Jesus, who defeats Satan, gaining back the keys to death and Hades. That is old folklore built upon even more ancient folklore. Now, I think one of the fun things we can do is look at the facts that we know via science in terms of this world and its species and how things work together, and understand that this is already functionally wrong. We know that serpents and snakes evolved long before Homo sapiens were ever on the scene. We know that they can slither and climb, not just stuck to their bellies. Even though it says they are cursed above all livestock, if you just consider what has happened, especially with factory farming when it comes to livestock, you will know that no, they have not been cursed above the livestock. Maybe whoever wrote this had a really myopic view of right then and there. The one part that it got right, as well as many other cultures did, is this natural enemy status between snakes and us. And it's not just true for snakes, it's true for other things. Spiders is another one. In fact, there's been a lot of evolutionary biology research into this, and it's really fascinating. We have kind of this instinct, this aversion built into us throughout the course of evolution to be afraid of these kinds of things on account of the fact that they could kill us, not talk to us, tempt us, and deceive us. Also, the very fact that God felt the need to curse the serpent, I think is so funny. Clearly, the story is just myth. And it might even not have ever been meant to be literal. In fact, many Christians who are kind of gaining an understanding of science and understand that, the order of creation is off and talking serpents don't make sense, and that this is about some kind of meta truth about evil and knowledge and these kinds of things, sure, fine, except you already know a lot more than a lot of the other people in your Bible. We have many people referencing back in a literal sense to Adam and Eve. In fact, when Paul tells women they are not allowed to speak, his example is because it was Eve who was so easily deceived by the serpent, and thus women as a whole are lesser than man and untrustworthy in these leadership positions and teaching. He does not permit it. Furthermore, the genealogies of Jesus, which are so important for so many different reasons to make the atonement actually work, trace him, at least in Luke, all the way back to Adam, step by step, son by son. And again, we wouldn't need Jesus at all if it wasn't for this original sin, this curse being brought into the world via this story. So is as literal or as metaphorical as you want to take it, that's on you. But the entire religion only works or makes sense. Your personal relationship with Jesus only exists because of the payment he had to make for you because of this incident that happens and is recorded in your Bible. So, since I'm taking some parts really seriously, like the fact that serpents shouldn't be able to speak and never crawled on legs, I just wanted to ward off any of those, well, yeah, but it's a metaphor anyways. But I think that's enough on the serpent. Let's move on to the next curse here, which starts with verse 16. To the woman, he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And so we have two things happening for women here. We have pain in childbirth, which is also going to lead to a not perfect process. I think we could imagine in a perfect utopia like Eden that was supposed to reflect heaven, that if reproduction was even on the schedule, it would have been perfect without complication, error, or death. And so all that is introduced into the world, as well as the secondary status of the woman. Now, you could make some arguments that that was always going to be the case, even in perfection. After all, Eve is an afterthought. Well, it depends, actually, because in one order of creation, God makes man and then woman, and in another, he says, let us make man and woman, where he had her in mind the whole time. So you'll have to do some reading there and see which one you agree with. But regardless, we know the initial plan, at least in how it presented itself, was man, Adam, and that afterwards we get the second and apparently lesser of the sexes, Eve. But somehow, if we can believe that they were equal in the beginning in the garden, that is now going to change, as her curse will be that he will rule over her. In fact, as soon as these curses end, the very next thing that happens, I think it's in verse 20, is that Adam names the woman Eve. This isn't some slight thing. Naming equals ownership, especially back then. But it's true even today. When something gets invented or something gets discovered, it is that person who gets to name it. Parents name their children, not vice versa. It is a position of authority and power. So the very fact that Eve was named by Adam immediately after these curses, I think just goes to show how much this is indeed the case. But let's talk about these two things. I want to look at the real world implications that have happened since because of this curse. We can infer pain in childbirth can also lead to the complications where both the mother and or the child can die. Now, let's just start with the pain part. As someone who has seen a woman give birth without any medical assistance, I can assure you this is straight up torture. If you pulled any woman aside and just did this to her for 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, it would be indistinguishable from torture. And yet it is what God has chosen to do for each and every single birth that would ever happen until we intervened, which is also something interesting. We came up with medicine. We came up with the epidural. We came up with antibiotics. We came up with germ theory. None of this was information that was provided to us in the Bible. And why would it be? It's not a science book, right? Even though it gives us a ton of other science-related things that all just look like pure superstition with what we know now. Plus, God wouldn't want to give us the out for getting out of the curse. But funny that modern science beat God's eternal curse. I mean, it was just one guy, this guy here, who figured out, hey, if we start washing our hands before we assist these women with pregnancy, the mothers don't die anymore from infection. But I'm on another side point. Getting back to the harm besides the torture aspect, let's talk about how many women and children have died because of this curse. Now, it's going to be kind of hard because we know that there's been about 108 billion people on the planet. But if we're trying to take this story seriously, we have to go with a kind of young Earth creationist aspect. And so with only 6,000 to 8,000 years, it's hard to come up with what that number would be if we really started with Adam and Eve. I mean, first of all, it just simply doesn't work. You can't just start with those two or bottleneck again and start over with Noah. But that's how the story goes. So we can just go for a number in the middle, 50 billion people. And I'm referencing my math here, so I apologize for looking down, but we need to reference a few things: the maternal mortality rate as well as the infant mortality rate. So approximately 1,000 to 1,500 deaths per 100,000 live births in ancient and pre-modern societies. That's an average because things again have gotten better, but that translates to 1 to 1.5% of mothers dying during childbirth, and that's being conservative. Then if we look at the infant mortality rate, this has been as high as 30 to 50% of children dying during childbirth or infancy in ancient times, and that number steadily improving over time, but so has the population. So again, I'm not a mathematician, but I'm trying to take all of this into consideration best that I can. So if we assume that 50 to 60 billion people have lived, then accounting for deaths and replacement rates, we could estimate that 75 to 90 billion live births would have occurred over this period. So going down to just 1% for the maternal mortality rate, that's 750 million to 900 million women who have died during childbirth. When we look at infant deaths using just a 30% across the board, that's 22.5 to 27 billion infant deaths. Now, not to mention miscarriages would need to be attributed to God. And we know that 1 in 3 pregnancies end in miscarriage. That's another 37.5 to 45 billion miscarriages. Now, fine, you don't want to count miscarriages? No big deal. You don't like my math? Let's cut it in quarters. Being absolutely insanely conservative, we would come up with at least 200 million dead mothers and 6 billion dead infants. Extrapolate that out to the suffering for the families. And this curse alone is the greatest horror that has ever happened to mankind. It makes the Black Death look like a cold. It makes the Holocaust or the gulags or any of these other comparative horrendous things. I'm not minimizing them, but in comparison to this, it's summer camp. It barely registers on a scale, and it's not over. I looked up the stats on a day-to-day basis. This is what we get from the reporting of the World Health Organization. 808 women die every single day from pregnancy or child-related issues. So today, another 800 women will be wiped off the face of the planet because of this supposed curse. And 6,500 infant deaths happen every single day from complications during or shortly after childbirth. So bam, 7,000 people gone every single day because of this curse. And it will continue, if not increase, as the population does. Unless, of course, we continue to get better and better at our side of things. Again, I know that this isn't the case. I understand that reproduction as a natural evolutionary thing is going to provide these unfortunate outcomes. But at least it's natural. At least there's no evil intent or retribution or sense of vengeance behind it. At least it's not coming from the same God that billions of people are praying to every single day. Praying, by the way, for their future kids or their pregnant wives. Thanking God left and right for all of the successful births and healthy moms while completely ignoring or blaming Satan or some other incorrect source for when things go differently. So no, I don't believe in this God. I don't blame this God. But again, for the billions of Christians who do believe in this God, especially the ones who have ever lost a child or a mother or a wife because of this, I'd encourage you to consider your story. It is not some beautiful story about God making all the flowers and animals and breathing life into the dust of the earth to create humans and having this perfect plan for them that goes south because of some bad snake. God is in charge of all of this. He, with his foreknowledge, did all of this. He got to make up the rules. He chose these ones. He got to make up the curses, and he chose this. And all because someone who didn't yet have the knowledge of the difference between good and evil listened to a talking snake in a garden that didn't say anything incorrect and took a bite of fruit for the pursuit of knowledge. But yes, continue to tell me that billions of deaths so far and another 7,000 per day for the foreseeable future makes sense as a punishment or consequence for that action. Utter insanity. Now, that's only half of the woman's curse, and we won't take as much time with the second one, but the second one is, again, placing her beneath man, subservient to the greater sex. The harm this has caused, it's impossible to calculate like the last one, but I would argue it's got to be even higher. How many women throughout history have had a severe lack of freedom in comparison to man? How many have been overpowered, abused, and raped? How many have been sold as property, as a sexual thing, and not even a being? Even looking at the world today, which is arguably the best it's ever been, and it's horrendous for most women around most parts of this world. And if you don't believe that, you're simply ignorant of what is going on in the world. Yeah, Brandon, but that's with like other religions. Like what you're thinking of is probably like Muslim women. Yeah, because that's not a direct representation of Old Testament women, which is always hilarious to me. Thankfully, despite despite the religion, yes, most of Christianity has moved on past covering up their women and selling them or giving them to their rapist for 50 shekels. But that was the original plan. That's what's in the Bible. We advanced morally without it. It's only been 100 years that women in this country have even had the right to vote. So please, let's not act like it is the Judeo-Christian value that gives us equality. It's not. And there's simply too many verses from your own Bible to show exactly what God thinks of women, exactly how less they are than man, and exactly how unimportant they are. And remember, your God is immutable. That's what your God thinks of women. And so again, I can't even begin to think of how we could quantify the harm that has happened by taking 50% of all people that have ever lived and making them less than and subservient to man. Let's move on to the final curses, which are for the man. This starts in verse 17. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And then the Lord himself gets right to work making skins for clothing for Adam and Eve because they are no longer under his protection of the perfect garden. So there's kind of a fourth curse there if you continue reading, and that is now that all animals also have to endure, and this is nothing small. Trillions of living creatures have had to endure being eaten as their main end and being killed or slaughtered as their only good use to provide us with their meat or their skin or their bones or their organs, etc. So animals, which had nothing to do with this, save for one special speaking serpent, from a numbers perspective, take the total brunt of this. So talking about man's curse, it's the curse of work. And this curse has absolutely changed the world. If there ever could have been a case where work wasn't required, which we know that's not the case. But insofar as the story goes, let's talk about these implications. And you know what? The more that I'm thinking about it right now, it's not just the curse of work, it's also the curse of death. You are dust, and to dust you will return. And even what does God tell Adam before? On the day you will eat of this, you will surely die. Now, that doesn't happen, and so people have had to get creative and say, oh, well, it's a spiritual death. Or no, it is a literal death. Man was meant to live forever originally in the garden, but then death is a curse. So yeah, they didn't die that day, but they inherited death that day. And fine, I'll hop on board with that. Either way, we're looking at work and death. So let's start with work. How much time has this robbed of people? Time is the most precious and important thing in the world. That might get diminished by the idea of an afterlife like heaven, but hey, we're back in Genesis. We don't have an afterlife here. We have Sheol. There's no heaven or hell in the Old Testament. That's why death made such a good curse and such a good consequence for many people. And that's also why in the Old Testament we see actual riches and wealth being used as the blessing. Totally different than storing up your treasures in heaven. No, this is the one life you get. So if you're doing right by God, like Job or Solomon or David or any of these patriarchs, you get physically blessed in the here and now. Even God's chosen plan for his people to inherit the promised land, Canaan, a land of milk and honey. It's a physical reward because that's all there is. And so a physical consequence, death, the end, no more existence, no more wealth or love or food or sex or any good thing here. And so work robs us of that time. That's the biggest thing I see. It is a thief to our actual existence. It still is. And it's gotten way better. Most people in at least the Western parts of the world have a more fair, at least in comparison with all of history, work-life relationship. You can't work before a certain age. That's incredibly new in the history of time. Most people working only 5 days a week and only for a portion of their day, even though it's a pretty large portion, typically still a third of the day. And again, we're talking about for a select group of people in a select time. If you consider all people for all time, many people have existed for nothing but work. Literally their entire life. Work and sleep and suffer. Work is a thief Work is a tormentor. Most of the work that has ever happened in most of the world for most of all time has been incredibly hard, backbreaking, dangerous. Even the work that many people get to enjoy today that won't threaten their life is so tedious and monotonous that it threatens their mental stability. I'm as privileged as it gets when it comes to this curse. At minimum, I need to work 40 hours a week to provide and survive. I get to do most of that from within the confines of my home. I'm paid a fair wage. I have the chance to make more based off my performance. I can take time off when I'm sick. I can take time off to vacation. I can choose who I work for. And yet, even for me, it still takes up a third of my life. During the best years of my life, very few people escape the curse of work. And for most people, it has been the worst possible thing imaginable. Now, there have been a few people who tried to escape it, and you know what it led to? Slavery. That's right. Without the curse of work, you don't have slavery. This is by far the biggest fallout from this curse. If there's a need to work, then there will always be abuses within that need. God recognized that. That's why he gave his people permission to own slaves as long as they were foreigners. The same God who gives us the curse to work, giving us express permission to own slaves and even to abuse them, just not to a certain degree. So within this curse to work, we've talked about man, we've talked about time, we've talked about slavery, but this goes on. It affects the environment and all of the animals. How many animals have we literally also enslaved to continue to do work for us because the work needs to be done? And through industrialization, which is just allowing us to work better, sometimes, look at what we've done to our planet. The only home we'll ever get. Again, this is of no consequence to God, of course, but if this God were true, and if this story were true, and if this curse were true, it would be the downfall of literally everything. And then again, the last curse here is that of death itself. Now, I wouldn't want to live forever anyways, but look at what death has brought in. The anxiety, the fear, the loss, the hurt. I mean, even religion itself, I think, is a byproduct of death. We don't know what happens. Someone was here and now they're not. Their body's here, but the lights are out. Where did they go? What does this mean? How do we cope? What stories do we tell ourselves about where they are or how we get there? Religion. And then look at all of the harm of religion. And yes, when you zoom out and you put all of this together, these three curses here essentially make up for the entirety of the harm and suffering that go on in this world. That's God's answer to two people who didn't know any better and a talking snake making one bad choice one time. That's his level of forgiveness and grace and love and justice. It leaves us with two very obvious conclusions. If this God is real, he is not of the nature of which you praise him for. Or more likely, this God is not real and all of this is just what we would expect in a naturalistic environment. One of the biggest things getting in the way is these religious ideas that we are supposed to be under this curse, that women are supposed to be less than man, that it's normal and natural because of God to lose children and wives, that it's normal and natural because of God to have to work and miss out on what this life could be and toil and sweat and subjugate. These ideas get in the way of improvement. I've shown it before in other videos, and I think it would be pretty obvious with what we've covered here today. In the places where we've already filled what gaps used to be associated with God, with science and knowledge and study and improvement, things have drastically gotten better. Again, just look at the one example of how many women today don't die in childbirth when and where they have access to modern medicine. Look at that insane improvement that had nothing to do with God, and that if we had kept reading the book about what to do, we would have never gotten there. We would have been under his supposed curse. And I could go on, but I'll just stop and say this. Read your Bibles. This happens right away. It should have stuck out to all of us. But through indoctrination and the way that the Bible studies are worded and which verses we choose to memorize and what gets pointed to the most and what verse was on the screen on Sunday and all of these things, it leads to this clouded idea where even if we recognize some of these things, we have to put it back on us. Oh, look at how evil we are. I didn't eat from that tree. There's nothing I've done in my entire life that would warrant billions of women and children dying. But that's what the story tells you. It tells you you're dust, you're evil, you're bad, and you're broken, and you deserve death and hell. But wait, If you believe the right thing, you can escape all of that after I put you through the punishment for what your great all the way back supposed grandparents Adam and Eve did before they had the knowledge that it was even wrong. If that makes sense to you, or if you're still finding ways to excuse this through insane apologetics or horrible mental gymnastics, both of which usually lead back to you having a problem that you don't actually have. You are not inherently sinful. I don't care about the philosophical arguments about if we're mostly good or mostly not good, evil. These terms are gross. They're built out of this idea. You want real personal responsibility? Don't have an actual scapegoat built into your book. People are people, men and women and people here and people there, people now and people in the past. We're just people, and people have potential, and that potential is shaped by their environment and their nature, their DNA. But the more that we say that our nature is broken, cursed, and damned, and our environment is also cursed and broken, of course we're going to stay stuck. What if we considered that we were just people, and we had a great potential to do better and to live better and to even think better when we let go of these fairy tales that are horrendous at their core? This is how the story starts, and it's just disgusting. So I will shut up. Thank you for being here today. Very curious to hear your thoughts on all of this. I'll see you Tuesday for another video. And until then, keep thinking. I'd like to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and StrongRex, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Jeff, Jeffrey, JimothyJones, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Shan, Sparky, Thronus, and Todd J, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.